Okay, and now I will hand it over to Dan to do a panel on CI/CD teams and tools. Nope.
Can everyone hear me? Awesome. My name is Dan Lawrence. I'm going to be moderating this panel today. I'm a software engineer at Google. I work on the Tecton project with Christy, and I'm also on the CDF Technical Oversight Committee. Do you all want to introduce yourselves? Start over there.
Hi, I'm Dawn Parzych. I am a developer advocate for LaunchDarkly, and sorry. I like to say being a developer advocate means I help people be better at their jobs as well as be better humans.
Yeah, it's weird. It's cutting in and out. Hello. I'm Eric Sorenson. I work at Puppet. I'm a technical product manager, and I've been working with some of our new cloud-native stuff, including a new product that we're building on top of Tecton. This
we'll try. And yeah. Okay. Did you hear what they said, or we can? Okay. I am Vincent Demeester. I work for Red Hat, and I'm a Tecton contributor, and I work on integrating Tecton inside OpenShift, and that's all for now.
Hello, everyone. My name is Angel Rivera. I'm a developer advocate for CircleCI, and yeah, like Dawn, I engage at a grassroots level with developers and try to figure out how people are using technology, and also how I bring back data to my team and enable them to build products that are useful for developers.
Cool. Thanks, everyone. So to get this started off, something Angel brought up before, but the topic here is called teams and tools, which I think is a pretty interesting topic. I think everyone here knows that people ship software and not tools. Tools are fun and useful, and we love to talk about them, so we're going to be doing that today. But it's really teams and culture and processes and people that make shipping software productive and fun. So Angel had some ideas on different things to look for in CI/CD and how that affects team culture.
Yeah, so I submitted a talk for this conference or this summit. I guess we're all a bunch of rejects, but it's just cool that I was able to still, talk about the things I wanted to talk about. But to start off, I think I submitted a talk about how an individual could actually glean some information out of an existing team or companies or organizations' pipelines, right? So imagine if you're looking for a new gig, one of the things that you could probably, that awkward phase of the interview at the end when they ask you, hey, you have any questions for us? I would ask them, can I see your CI/CD pipelines, if that's your thing, right? So for me, at least working at Circle, I've learned a lot about how to gauge teams. So we run 30 million builds per month. We have a lot of data about the performance of these teams, right? And that's a specific aspect for CI/CD. So we have insights into how people are running their code on our platform, which is really in a really unique position to be in. And some of the things that I've learned, just from talking to our data team and getting information on how they're running jobs. One instance is, if you're looking at a pipeline and they're only testing their code and they're not deploying with it, that tells me that they're more focused on CI, right? They're more focused on performance within their teams. But then I also have conversations when I'm at conferences like this with teams, and I ask them, or they're asking me about, hey, how are you different than any other product out there? And the first thing, generally, that's like a red flag for me. When I get that question, I stand back and I go, well, wait a minute. So tell me about your CI/CD culture, right, and your DevOps culture. Because that's really important. And I tell them, if you don't really have a tight culture in that aspect, then switching out the tool is not going to solve your problems. You're just going to create have the same problems with a different tool. So yeah, that's kind of like the mantra that I live by when I'm talking to new customers or people that are looking to switch things up in their DevOps culture.
Sorry to any CI/CD vendors here.
It's an interesting point that the someone on the earlier talk said. Yeah, I'll just give up on it. Someone on one of the earlier talks said that was talking about value stream mapping, and I think it's really interesting that the visualization of your CI/CD pipeline, if you really got everything laid out, is actually it's a map of what your organization looks like. It's a representation of all the touch points that somebody used to have to do as part of their job in order to get code out into production, and we want to automate that as much as possible. So that's an interesting kind of exercise to see what it looks like to actually get code out.
And when you're looking at DevOps, there's this whole debate about what DevOps means. And people will say, DevOps is about culture, and it's about processes, and it's about people, and you can't buy DevOps, you can't buy a tool. But companies buy tools. They buy solutions, but you have to have the right people and the right processes in place to be able to use those tools effectively. So while you can't buy that right tool, you can make sure you have the right people on the team, so when you're implementing a tool, you're not wasting people's time and money.
Has anyone seen any other huge red flags or warning signs when looking at a team or company's CI/CD system, or lack thereof, I guess?
Let's say it's not necessarily looking at a system, but hearing the phrase, well, we move fast and break things, that to me is a huge red flag. It means that people don't really have processes in place, that they're just trying to move as quickly as possible because they've been told to be an elite company, you have to deploy faster. You have to be continuously moving, and you can break things and deploy to production. But the problem is the companies that do that, they have the right processes in place. They have the right people in place to be able to do that. And if you don't have that, the only thing you're breaking consistently is the people that are working for you.
I had a funny experience with that a while back when I made a product call to remove an older version of the API. And I was like, hey, we got told to move fast and break things. And the immediate response was, not that thing.
Also, there's a kind of, not red flag, but yellow flag is when you hear some people or some teams asking you, I don't know, I want to use Tecton, for example, for our project or for something. And usually when I hear that, I like, cool, because I work on Tecton, so use my software. But why Tecton and not something else? The tool is not the end goal, is like the implementation details. So if you want to use Tecton, what is the reason for you to use Tecton? Is there even a reason? What's really your need, and then we can see if Tecton fits or not, and if it doesn't fit, should it fit, and stuff like this, yeah.
Yeah, so some of the red flags I see, at least for me, is, again, like what almost everyone said here, is people have an idea that, they have to run a certain way. They come to these conferences, they learn about new tooling, new maybe strategies, and they inevitably kind of fail dramatically because they're not big enough, right? So they're trying to run like Google or Amazon or whatever. And I encounter this quite a bit with startups. They really need to move fast and lean, but they're trying to implement all these extraneous kind of systems, and they don't really have a good understanding. Actually, really do. Sorry about that. But yeah, that's a red flag for me. Is trying to behave like a big established company when you're really not.
I'm sure all of you are sitting here and have taken furious notes today and over the next 3 days about, oh, I went to this talk and we have to do this thing, and this is the best way of doing it. You have to remember that what people are talking about is what worked for them at a specific time with a specific group of people. If you change the people or the time or anything, like that project may not be as successful. So don't take what you hear as gospel that this is the way of doing things. They're not best practices. These are suggested practices. We may figure out a better way of doing things later, and then that best practice is no longer going to be applied.
Coming back to your point about moving fast and breaking things, I think this is probably the 7th time somebody's mentioned the Accelerate book today. It's a great book if you didn't hear about it the other 6 times. But they show through a lot of data that moving fast and breaking things is not necessarily a trade-off you have to make. High-performing teams can move fast without breaking things. At the same time, though, the takeaway shouldn't be that these very high-performing teams are pushing every change to production in an automated fashion. If we want to ship stable software, we should just start pushing every single commit to production as fast as possible. There's a whole bunch of groundwork that you have to build up and infrastructure and processes before you can get to that point. What are some of the first things you think people should look at improving when trying to get to that spot where you can move fast without breaking things?
I think it starts with the design and the planning phase. And think about really, why are you doing this? What are the goals you're trying to achieve, and how is this going to help your users? It's great to be able to build fun, cool things, but if it's not going to substantially help your end users, then why are you building it? And so when you're building it, build it and start getting feedback early. Do beta programs, do canary launches. Figure out a way to release a feature to a small group. Get data to support whether or not that change is a good change or not a good change. And you have to be able to trust the data. Instead of saying, well, we weren't testing with the right users. If the data says no, then think about, well, how does it need to be changed? So look at the data in your planning phase and design and early testing periods.
There was a phrase I heard from one of the rancher folks a few weeks ago that was a customer story that they were telling about removing all of the undifferentiated heavy lifting that they do out of their development lifecycle. And that really resonated for me. It was like, what is it that we're doing that seems really hard and complicated that's actually not differentiated? That is, it's not part of the value that we're trying to deliver to our customers. And how can we externalize that as quickly as possible and make that somebody else's problem, either by using an existing service that's already out there, integrating with something, using an upstream open source project, or something that's like not, so that we can focus on the part that is, like you said, that's really important to the users, and that we actually is going to make or break us, rather than spending months and months making this plumbing that is ultimately not differentiating.
Build versus buy debate.
Yeah, so definitely my advice is to try to tie everything you do back to a value for your business, right? Because at the end of the day, like everyone said, you can build this plumbing and it'd be really cool for your team and useful to you, but to your customers, is it really? And are you going to generate revenue if you're a company on that? I see, companies struggle with that all the time. And it's quite sad because they have really good ideas, but I don't think it's very focused to their user base or their customers.
Right, and to get back to Eric's point, I think this is where most of the projects in CDF are really interesting, because this is where Tecton fits really well, where you can, let's just focus on something that everybody is going to build on top of and add our value on top of it. So I think this is why CDF exists even.
All right, so we can switch over now. This is Cloud Native KubeCon. So continuous delivery isn't just about Cloud Native, but a lot of Cloud Native concepts do come into play, and that's why a lot of us are here today. So how do you think the switch to Cloud Native software and Cloud Native software development changes CI and CD, or does it?
I think it doesn't change too much in terms of how it works from the user perspective. From how it's implemented, it changed a lot, because we're, again, taking the Tecton example, everything is now optimized for containers, building into containers, making everything run into containers, and we usually build containers. And yeah, I think this is the main thing. And the other thing is, like, I think having it simplifies some part of the CI/CD system that were tricky to get right before. All the orchestration part is already there. We can just build on top of the orchestrator we have already, so Kubernetes or whatever. And I think this makes this does the same as Tecton does for the common thing. We are reusing some standard, and we are building some standards so that people can add their value on top of it.
If companies didn't have a solid CI/CD process, workflow, and pipeline in place, a lot of this cloud native and microservices stuff wouldn't work, right? Because the talks earlier were saying you go from having a single workflow to now you have multiple workflows. So if you don't have a good workflow and process down, for one, you can't multiply that exponentially. So having that good workflow and those good processes in place is really what's enabling this shift.
I come from a systems administration ops background, and the thing that I think is different about cloud native, maybe not in the delivery pipeline, but in the operational concerns of it, is every system is now a distributed system, and distributed systems are hard. There's a lot of complex failure modes that can happen. Things are not easy. You can't just log in, if everything's containerized, you can't log into a system and tail a log file to figure out what's wrong. You have to level up the operability of your application at the same time you do the architecture and the delivery pipeline of it. And so stuff like building observability in from the beginning becomes like, it's not optional. You have to do that, or when something does break at 2 a.m. and somebody's responsible for figuring out what's wrong, it will be at a loss, or it will take hours, or you will be losing money, and you can't wing it. You have to plan for that kind of operational concern from the start.
Yeah, so I agree with all those points, and I also want to add a layer for security. You know, we're moving fast, we're breaking things all the time, but we're not securing things very well. And I think that's, you know, with DevSecOps now, right, that's kind of the latest buzzword, but it's real. And I think, you know, having worked in the federal government and different layers of security, we definitely need to start thinking about that a little bit better. It's great to move fast, but you also have to lock things down because it's only going to get worse, right, moving forward. And I don't see many open source projects dealing with that. There are some vendors, but and it's growing in our space, but I think more attention needs to be paid to that portion of it.
Anyone else have anything they want to add on the security point? I think that's a pretty big one that we've missed a lot. Nobody? Perfect. Right. So kind of what you mentioned a few minutes ago with the kind of rise of microservices, one of the big changes in cloud native architectures is that there's a lot more delivery pipelines. That means there's a lot more systems that people are using to build these pipelines. One of the goals of the CDF and a bunch of the projects was to help provide a place that people could focus on interoperability and compatibility. Eric put together an awesome Google Doc over the past couple months, was it months of work, kind of analyzing how far apart all the different tools are. How far apart are we? Are we close? What is our future?
If you're interested in reading it, you can go to the short URL is pup.pt for puppet/CD steps, all one word. But yeah, it's a long Google Doc that I tried to take a look at the different tools as well as some of the SaaS stuff that's in use, like Github Actions, where you can't necessarily run it yourself, but you can make use of it and figure out, like, is there a point of interoperability that we can, and points of reuse that we as a community could converge and bring things together? And it seemed to me like the closest thing is the step, like the individual unit of work. All the different tools seem to have something. Those are all containers, so it seems like it ought to be possible to make those reusable. And the benefit of that would be, like, if you're somebody that runs, that built a tool that does syntax checking or linting or security scanning or whatever, you should only have to make one container and have that be reusable across whether it's Jenkins X that people are using or Spinnaker or any of the other tools. That seemed to be the place to kind of standardize and to work on. The higher order of abstractions, the workflows, I didn't really feel like they were that reusable because there's so much business logic that's encoded in those. It's not like I can go and take your pipeline and just drop it into my site in the same way that I can those more unitary, single units of work that you can as a containerized step. So yeah, I think there's a lot. Things are pretty close. It's not like wildly divergent, and the fact that they are largely containerized steps really helps a lot. I would say GitHub Actions are probably the furthest away just because they're so closely tied to GitHub's operating environment. They can make assumptions about the fact that it's running on Azure. It has both a real VM and a containerized, like a Docker environment that you can run in, and Actions can run in either one, which is great for them, but it's hard to do that if you're not running in that environment. But yeah, there's lots of opportunity to bring that stuff together. Angel's itching to jump in.
Well, at the heart of it, right, so CI/CD enables you to build your code or build your products faster and with quality, right, high confidence. So what we see a lot is, folks are kind of stuck with their pipelines. They're counting the seconds, literally watching the builds. And when I hear that behavior, I tell them, you're doing it wrong. You should let the system just fail you, and then you go look in the dashboards, because at the end of the day, if you want to get faster, do things a lot quicker. And to getting back to your point about the containerization, we provide what we call convenience images, so that speed, right? You don't have to download, because I don't care what system you're on. If you're building a custom image and you don't have it sitting in a registry, and a lot of folks like to build, believe it or not, they just use a Docker file and then build right, because they want to know, they want to have all these pieces, like, I guess, virgin, right? And then just go right on down and build that way. Whereas when you have these convenience images, that speeds up that process for them. But then again, right, we get complaints that, oh, well, you don't have this tool installed, so then we have to add that. And then the other part of that is the image becomes huge, right? Gigs, and that slows you down as well.
Anything else to add there?
I could talk about it all day.
Yeah. Cool. All right, so we have a couple minutes left. Open it up for questions from the audience. I guess we only have one microphone though, so I'll run it. You can run it.
Anybody with a question?
Right up here.
So for companies going down this route for the first time, what advice would you guys give them when going from a monolith approach over to a CI/CD?
Who wants to take it?
You got the mic.
Yeah, so I don't think that matters, right? So for CI/CD, if you're distributed or monolith, it doesn't matter. I guess the advice is first, work out the cultural issues on your team. I tend to give the advice that your team should be socializing around your code before it even gets committed to a branch. So if you get tasked with some, sprints, some sprint tasks, you know who's working on what, and at some point there's going to be a convergence, right? Someone's going to touch the same code as you. At that point, you should work out, hey, well, it makes sense for maybe you to go first, and then I can do that work after.
I would say to start small. Don't try to take the most mission-critical application or project and try to change that. Start with something where if it breaks, you're not seriously impacting the business. So start small, get those wins, and show that, like, hey, this can be done. And then as you ratchet up those wins, then you can start looking at, the larger applications and the more mission-critical pieces.
This is awesome.
Continuous microphone delivery. Had to say it.
So I know this isn't a roadmap session, but can you talk at all about, are there any plans to expand delivery endpoints beyond Kubernetes within the Tecton universe, or is that really something that isn't going to happen? Just talking about keeping it simple. Yeah, can you talk about that?
I can answer that for you.
So I think for the next part, we are trying to have at least stable API on top of Kubernetes. Once we have stable API, this means we have a stable contract, and then we will try to remove, or not remove, but abstract the Kubernetes dependency so that you could run it elsewhere. We don't really made any roadmap on this, except we just discussed it a bit internally, so it might happen someday. I can't give you any data, but it might. Did you want to?
So there's a distinction too between the implementation of Tecton running in Kubernetes and the things that you can deploy with Tecton. And while Tecton is tied at the moment to Kubernetes for the way that it works, you can deploy whatever you want with it. Like it just runs steps that are containerized and does things to your images and your source code and stuff. And so there's not, you could use Tecton if you felt like it to deploy like war files out onto mainframes if that was your thing. But you would have to have a Kubernetes cluster running somewhere to run the actual Tecton software on in order to do that. So there's a distinction between those two things.
So interesting question about deploying directly into production, allowing developers to do that. And you answered with hypothesis-based development, which is absolutely valid. But I still work with a lot of customers, and especially this gentleman, federal government, you know the story. High command and control. How do you get to a point where you can get them to a space where they feel like Etsy, where they can trust the developers are going to do the right things, that the systems are solid enough to do the things that the security guys normally did as their check boxes or whatever? Because that's the transition that seems to be so hard, that breaking that culture. And I don't see, what was the first step or things that you might do?
Can I take this one? Yeah, so since I kind of worked in the government, I still have ties to those folks. And yeah, so I think they are adopting. When I started working in the government, I was a big champion of open source. And you wouldn't believe how many times I got shot down. And, it's like, they're like, no, they can see the code. I'm like, yeah, so can we, right? Like, that's the whole point. But people were nervous. They didn't understand, I think. And now, 10, 12 years later, they have code.gov. So I think that mentality, that mentality is kind of diminishing, and they're adopting. I speak to federal government contractors and employees all the time, and it's new blood. It's new regimes are coming in, and they're seeing the successes that the public sector's have or the private sector's having, and they're trying to build that. Now, there's regulations, of course. And they're a lot more stringent, but I see them definitely collaborating with the open source communities now and building out strategies to have more modern tactics and strategies for their development teams. So I think in the future, you're going to see in the government that mentality kind of grow, the DevOps mentality, right? The way we operate in private sector and public sector will probably be very, the only thing that'll divide us are security classifications, things like that.
I think we're just about out of time, so this will be our last question.
And I'm really sorry because it's not a question, but you mentioned DoD trying to lean into DevSecOps. There's Mr. Nicholas Shalon. He's the Chief Software Officer of the Air Force. He's doing a talk tomorrow. If you go to dsop.io, that container registry of hardened containers that are secure, he's working on it right now. You can go and contribute. You can go and pull hardened Red Hat images. And so we are working on it. Check out his talk and try to contribute to dsop.io. It's will help us all out.
So, thank you. And thanks to all of the panelists here.
Good job.